Hello, good evening, welcome, and thank you for being here. My name is Aakar, and we are joined by the author Arvind Narrain of this book, India's Undeclared Emergency, just out. Highly recommended. I have read it in full, and I hope to have a chat with the author today, and we'll take your questions towards the end. There is a comment box on the right in case you should have questions. Please type them in there. I'd like to thank Scroll for doing this. It's becoming increasingly difficult to have difficult conversations with the family in this country, and we are glad that we have this chance to be able to discuss what is going on in India today, and to have the opportunity to bring what it is that the author has to say to you. Let us start with the first chapter of the book. Arvind, tell us a bit about 1975 and in what sense it was a departure from what came before it in the constitutional sense.
Yeah, thanks Aakar for this and Scroll for this conversation. Thanks Aakar for being the generous host on this particular point. And it's great to get a chance to finally talk to you face to face, in spite of knowing each other for quite some time. Uh, the question with respect to why I begin by looking at the declared emergency as the parallel to the undeclared emergency. I think that's the question in effect you're asking. Uh, the I think one point to make before that is the constitutional framework. Though we have obviously a fundamental rights chapter, Article 22 and the authorization of preventive detention has been looked at by human rights activists in the past as the undemocratic heart of the Indian constitution. So there's been a bit of a critique, obviously, of the fact that our constitution provides preventive detention. In fact, in the first judgment,
could you very briefly, sorry, for those of us who don't know what 22 is and what preventive detention is, could you just very briefly tell us?
Sure. The Article 22, the fundamental rights chapter broadly recognizes your fundamental rights. Article 21 recognizes your right to life. Article 22 begins by stating that you have the right to legal representation. You have the right to be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours of arrest. All absolutely crucial and vital protections, as we all know, of any individual who comes in contact with the police. All this is great. Of course, it may not go far enough. That's one line of argument. But the bigger problem is, which it says that even these minimal protections will not apply in the context of a preventive detention law enacted by Parliament. So the idea that a fundamental rights chapter allows you to take away fundamental rights is at the heart of Article 22 itself, through the limitations that it imposes.
And just to understand, sorry, a preventive detention is the state holding somebody in custody without there being a crime having been committed. Would that be accurate?
That would be accurate. The point would be that you may not have committed anything, but the state has an apprehension that you could be a threat to national security, could be a threat to national integrity, etc., etc. And so they take you in before you even commit anything. So that's the preventive part of the detention dimension. And so obviously that it's an exception. Preventive detention is an exception to the idea of fundamental rights, because for the first time, you're not committed a crime, but you're still in jail. And in fact, the judges in the A.K. Gopal, which upheld the preventive detention law, even the judges in the majority said that this is an anomaly in the Constitution. The idea that you have preventive detention in the Constitution itself, and the fundamental rights chapter itself. So that's, in a sense, the starting point, as it were. Of course, since the 1950s, it's been, since colonial times, that particular provision has been used quite extensively. And I go a little bit actually into the A.K. Gopalan detention in particular. And he, in fact, one of our eminent human rights lawyers, K.J. Kanavaram, makes a very moving point about A.K. Gopalan, which is A.K. Gopalan was detained repeatedly by the colonial authorities. Independence comes. and this is A.K. Gopalan's speech. He says when Nehru and others were celebrating independence, I was in jail, and I decided to mark independence as well. So what he does is he takes the national flag and walks through the court through the prison. The prison authorities said they won't do lathi charge. They'll be a little kind and generous with him, so they just filed a sedition case against him. And A.K. Gopalan in court, he says he makes a very very beautiful speech where he makes this particular point. He says it's sad that things have come to this pass when those who were exciting disaffection against His Majesty's government are now in power, and I am being tried under the same particular law. So there is that history. And in A.K. Gopalan, the story doesn't end there because A.K. Gopalan then tried in Independence India as well under the Preventive Detention Act, which is the statute which is finally challenged before the law. So there is a history to the use of preventive detention in the context of independent India. Kashmir and the Northeast, of course, remain in a sense the exceptions even within this particular framework where it's always been used. That's that part of the story we know. So if we look at that, and in that particular context, why look at the 75 to 77 period as a particularly exceptional moment? That's the question we have to, which I have to try and answer for everybody here. And I think the way to phrase that is the 75 to 77 moment is that exceptional because of a range of factors coming into play. First, of course, is the extensive use of preventive detention law. It's not just in one state. It's across the country, and a nationwide kind of an arrest of dissenting individuals, people from political parties, as well as Shah Commission documents. People in political parties, people who are trade union activists, people who are student leaders are all picked up and arrested under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act. So it's a nationwide sweep, as it were. That's the first kind of thing which makes it fairly different from what came before. Again, you can argue it's building on what came before. It's not something that's completely new, but that's one dimension. The second dimension, which I go into in some detail, is the failure of all other institutions of accountability. That is the failure of the media. Civil society is anyway mostly in jail because protests and demonstrations are not allowed, and fundamentally the failure of the judiciary. And here it's an important point to make. I'll just make it through this maybe one example. The failure of the judiciary is in terms of the judgment in Jabalpur, where the Supreme Court basically puts forward the point of view that if you're arrested on the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, you have no right to challenge that detention, even if that detention is not in conformity with the law laid down by the Maintenance of Internal Security Act. Again, the point is it's a very narrow point. What you're basically saying is that if I'm detained under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, I have a right to be detained in accordance with what the law says. The law provides certain reasons. The law gives a detaining authority. The law provides for the fact that there must be a signature. The detaining authority must be signed and must be satisfied that my detention is necessary in the interest of national security. If that basic kind of a documentation is not there, the person cannot be detained. Why this is important is 9 high courts came to this conclusion, saying that yes, of course, we have a right to see if your detention is in conformity with the act. Supreme Court says that you don't have that particular right. And basically, that's the establishment of what I later on going to call the establishment of the prerogative state, with the unconstrained power of the executive, untrammeled by any kind of a control, any kind of a check, particularly the check by the judiciary. Even the minimal check of saying, is your detention in conformity with the law laid down by statute meant to detain people? So that's the other dimension of the
just to jump in again, could you just explain to us your juxtaposition of this with what you call the normative state, very briefly and very simply?
Sure. I go to make the distinction between what I call the normative state and the prerogative state. Again, distinction draws from actually a really fascinating book called The Dual State by a German Jewish labor lawyer called Ernst Frankel. And it's really fascinating. Ernst Frankel is in the middle of the Nazi Holocaust. He's in the middle of Nazi Holocaust, and he's saying, I need to understand what is going on around me. Right? What is this regime really about? Right? And then he comes up with this theory that the Nazi state is what he calls the dual state, with a battle between what he calls the normative state, which is a state committed to the idea of the rule of law, and the prerogative state, which is a state basically unbounded by any legal framework and having untrammeled executive power and authority. That would be the prerogative state. So if you look at it that way, the prerogative state in India is embedded in some provisions such as the preventive detention laws, where there's no check from any other detaining authority. And today we argue that the prerogative state is really embodied in laws such as the UAP. But that's, I think, the conversation we want to get to a little later, if I understood you. Aakar?
Yes. Yeah. I had two more things to ask you. One is slightly technical, perhaps, which is that in a part of the world where the state has such overwhelming power and the judiciary and the police tend not to be as independent as one might wish them to be, why is it that what happened in 1975 happened? Why was there a need for the state and this party and this charismatic, powerful leader to lock people up without trial?
That's an interesting point. I guess we go back to the idea that we understand the Constitution as really a product of struggle. We understand, in spite of Article 22, we understand the fundamental rights chapter as really a product of struggle. We understand the fact that the idea of the rule of law, flawed as it is, imperfect as it is, what exists is really emerges from the context of struggle. And those are the values which are there. That is the normative state. So the state is far more powerful than the prerogative state. With the emergency, the prerogative state overshadows the normative state. The two states are always there, but the balance shifts dramatically during the emergency towards the unconstrained part of the executive.
Tell me, is India an outlier amongst parliamentary democracies in having this kind of dual structure within prerogative state, normative state? Also, are we an outlier within the Commonwealth and within other parliamentary democracies in having such things as Article 22 and the free use of it by the state?
This is again it's a good question, and the idea that the way I'd phrase it is again Frankel's point is this: you're talking about Nazi Germany, and he says Nazi Germany is a dual state. The battle between the prerogative state and the normative state. And his argument for that is this: he says, end of the day, he says for capitalism to flourish, you need rule of law. If the Nazis were interested in capitalism, there had to be some minimal quality of rule of law. You couldn't be completely arbitrary, because what is rule of law? End of the day, it is the fact that you apply decisions in a certain uniform fashion. That what happened to A will also happen to B. If you don't have the basic fundamental of a rule of law framework, then how will capitalism flourish? That's the question he's asking when he says that the normative state has to be there. So if you look at it from that framework, arguably every state has these qualities of being both normative and prerogative. And in particular, if you're looking at the prerogative state and its development post the 9/11 kind of a scenario, in all advanced industrial democracies, the prerogative state has made great inroads into the normative state. And I think the great example for that is the US and the Guantanamo Bay. I mean, what is Guantanamo Bay? You're actually finding a place which is outside the framework of national law, outside the framework of international law. If that is not the prerogative state within the heart of the normative state, what is?
You're referring to the jail in Cuba where the US sends people and who've been there for 20 years without a trial.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I have one last question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I said the reason they're able to do that. Yeah, please go on. You go on.
No, why don't you complete that?
No. I said, repeating myself. Actually, the reason they're able to do that is their legal argument is Guantanamo Bay is not bound by either international law or national law. So they found this peculiar space, which is outside the framework of all law, and that's really prerogative, the prerogative state.
My question on the first chapter, before we move on to the crisis of the present, is that it's normally seen, 75-77 is seen as a period where the political party in power was oppressing the political parties out of power. Your book refers to activists, to trade unionists, to the father of somebody, and you write this story in detail, who was detained and killed. So it's not really just about the government versus the opposition. Could you speak briefly to this, the idea that this was more than just about the fight between the parties?
I think Akar, that's again a very, very important point, because the how do we characterize the 75 to 77 regime itself? And I go actually to this one lens's use of this framework, what he calls an authoritarianism, an authoritarian state, uh, by which he means a state which is a form of what he calls sultanism, which relies on the unconstrained discretion of the ruler. And in this case, he refers in particular to looking at Indira Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi. 20-point program becomes a 5-point program of Sanjay Gandhi. Finally, becomes the 2-point program of slum demolitions and the and sterilizations. So that the argument being that, I mean, not Lynn's argument. This is Jaffrello and Anil's argument in their very, very good book called India's First Dictatorship. Their argument is that this choice finally depended on the Sultan of the day, which was really Sanjay Gandhi and his kind of preferences for these two policy choices, as it were. Why this is important is what yeah, of course, the rooting of the regime in their own presentation, 20-point program, is in socialist ideology. But the argument is that it never had any deep rootings, any form of socialism. Why you'd say this is if the majority of people, as you indicated, if you as the Shark Commission indicates, if you're arresting trade union leaders who should be in a support base, you're arresting them on a large number. What does it say about your rooting in a certain kind of a socialist ideology? So there's a way in which the regime, I mean, there's one way to analyze it, is a regime which is interested in power for itself, or it's a kind of a self-referential system of power that outside reference to ideology is fairly weak in terms of what they're actually able to do at the ground level, in terms of how they're able to mobilize a constituency which will support them. If you were a socialist regime, the trade unionists should have been on your side. They should not have been in jail. You should be able to mobilize a constituency of the poor and the marginalized, saying that they are going to be with us. Instead, the poor and the marginalized are the ones who are opposed to you because you're carrying out these forcible policies of sterilization and some slum demolitions on them. So there's a gap in a bit from the ideology they profess and what they actually do at the ground level. So it tells you again that that rooting in ideology is weak. It ends up being a certain kind of a regime which is interested in perpetuating its own power.
And tell me, do you have any thoughts on this? There are targets to be met by the state and officers on sterilization, on slum demolitions. Why is there very little or no resistance from within the state and the apparatus of the bureaucracy?
That may be, I'm not too sure I have a good answer to this. That may be more in the nature of the bureaucracy, right? I mean, if you take the same question to Nazi Germany and say, why was there no resistance among the bureaucracy in terms of implementing the final solutions?
Yeah.
That's in the nature of a bureaucracy whose imperative is to obey. If you don't obey, you're likely to penalties which are likely to be inflicted against you. Maybe just one more point on this is one way to answer this question may also be through a close reading of the Shark Commission reports, which provide a fantastic look at the way the emergency.
Just again, for the readers, what is the Shark Commission report, please?
Yeah, what happened post the lifting of the emergency is the Janata government then set up a commission of inquiry headed by Justice Shah, and the commission of inquiry was meant to look into the excesses committed during the emergency time period. They came out with three reports, and they looked in great detail into the question of both sterilizations as well as slum demolitions. On the slum demolitions, again, the one point to note is the demolitions were largest in Delhi. So Shah Commission comes up with one kind of a finding. They said the closer you were to the center of power, the more difficult it was to evade the power, in this case Sanjay Gandhi. So that might be one response. The further you're away from the power center, the easier it may be to subvert in some fashion or the other what the power is saying. That's one point. But actually the Shah Commission, if you read the Shah Commission on the sterilizations, the other point it makes is a certain kind of competitiveness, among various states. The states are given a target. I mean, this target may be 1 lakh sterilizations in a year. States will do 2 lakhs or 3 lakh sterilizations because there's a certain kind of they want to get to keep the leader happy. They know this is what keeps the leader happy, so they're willing to actually go one step ahead of what the leader actually asks.
Does that suggest to you, and you don't have to answer this specifically because I don't know the answer myself and I don't know if anybody else does, that in the face of a powerful and charismatic leader, the state in India tends to sort of soften or even collapse, and constitutionalism tends to be set aside in favor of the charismatic leader?
See, this I think gets back to, actually Baba Sahib Ambedkar's very important invocation of the issue of constitutional morality, right? Where he says democracy in India is a top dressing on a soil which is essentially undemocratic. Constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment; it has to be cultivated. So there is that sense. I mean, I think it's an important point, only because that sometimes we look to the state for answers, but I think equally the answers lies in cultivating that constitutional morality in a wider public. Saying that, I mean, the question again will come back. I'm sure we'll come to it. The question of the BK16 or the people who are arrested under these laws, it should matter to all of us. But that culture, that this, you don't detain people who are speaking their minds or for opposing the government, should be a more widely held sentiment. And that culture we still need to cultivate.
Okay, I think we've spent about 22 minutes on 1975, which is more than it perhaps deserved in 2022. You write that one of the differences between the declared emergency of 75-77 and what we are living through today in India, which is an undeclared emergency, right, is that the latter, what we are living through today, has popular support. Could you describe or sort of describe the contours of what you mean by that in the present time? Why does it have popular support, you think?
Yeah, the point I make is the parallel between the declared emergency and the undeclared emergency is what is the in today's context is the untrammeled use of the UAPA, the NIA, and unconstrained by any institutional framework, be it the media or be it the judiciary. This, of course, combined with the sense of fear, a palpable sense of fear, which people have about speaking out against the government for fear they may be arrested. That's the parallel between the two
Sorry to be banal again, but just for our viewers, by these two, you would suggest the power of the union to take over investigations from the state, A, and B, the use of a fairly draconian law to put people behind bars and keep them there.
Yeah, no, the UAPA point, I'll just make one point. UAPA, again, has a longer history. 1967, it's enacted. The most draconian of the amendments in terms of adding offenses such as terrorism to unlawful activity and also the criminalization of unlawful activity and association, as well as the point which I'm most concerned about is the amendment of the bail law, making bail all but impossible with the UAPA are the key changes. All of this happens in the Congress regime. BJP has nothing to do with it. Right? But the point which the about the UAPA, the one central point I'd make about the UAPA is look at all the figures. You get a sense that both the convictions and the acquittals are fairly small. Large majority cases just continue year after year after year. That's the central dimension of it. Why is this so central? Is because
with the accused still being in jail, you mean?
Exactly. Why it's so central is because the case continues year after year after year, and because of the bail provision, the accused is still in jail. There's one case from Gujarat where this the Sessions Court in Gujarat, where this young man, when he came from Kashmir to Gujarat to study medicine, he was held in a he he was accused under the UAPA. He spent 11 long years in jail, didn't get bail, but was finally acquitted. 11 years is a long, long time. And here the undeclared emergency becomes even more serious than the declared emergency. The point, why I make this point is this: preventive detention law, for all its problems, the maximum period of detention is 1 year under all the preventive detention laws we have in India. Under the Rowlatt Act, it was 2 years. Under the UAPA, when people spend 10 plus years in jail, that speaks to a failure which is very, very large, of the entire criminal justice system. And fundamentally, what we'd argue, what I argue, is the UAPA is a de facto preventive detention law, far more dangerous, far more onerous than the existing preventive detention laws. If you call a law as preventive detention, then you have the way of bringing some kind of safeguards around it. If you don't even call the law preventive detention, so that's what it does, then you're stuck with the beast we haven't even succeeded in naming. The UAPA should be fundamentally understood as a preventive detention law, and that should be the basis of its challenge more than anything else, because that's what is accounting for the misery in places around the country where people have been picked
and the
up.
reason you think it's more dangerous is because it lets the state keep people in jail for indeterminate periods, and so long as the state opposes the giving of bail, they do actually remain in jail. Would that be the reason why you think?
Yes, absolutely. Because see, even the previous anti-terror laws, be it POTA or TADA, had what they call a review committee, because they were seen as, again, see, it's very interesting, right? Even POTA and TADA were considered terrorist laws for which there was a certain kind of a departure from the existing criminal procedure code, which meant they had what was called a sunset clause, which is within 2 years or 3 years, the law had come before Parliament, and Parliament had to again debate and either to extend or not extend. Of course, TADA was extended a number of times, but the campaign got built up because each time you had to go and you had to extend that particular law. Here you have a law which is, there's no question of extension because it's there. It's a permanent part of the legal system, and this is Mr. Chidambaram's wonderful legacy as far as human rights in this country is concerned. And so he bears a big part of the blame as far as the preventive detention laws are concerned, as far as the UAP is concerned, and NIA. Both were enacted under his watch, really. So we have a fundamental bone to pick also with the Congress and the way they've enacted these laws, which the BJP is using today. That's okay. So yeah, sorry, please.
No, please.
So that's the UAPA, and I think the NIA is the other law which again needs a closer investigation. And the NIA.
Sorry, before we move to the NIA, tell me something. How would you respond to somebody from the other side, so to speak, who might say, well, these are people who are either guilty or suspected of being guilty of very heinous crimes, and it's okay for the state to lock such people up. And in any case, there's not that many of them. What would your response be to somebody who says that?
Well, I guess not that many of them. The PUCL, the People's Union of Civil Liberty, had a 3-day convention, looking at the entire question of the use of the UAPA, and the horrific testimonies from really around the country, from Punjab to Kerala to Telangana, where the state has used this law. And what does it use it fundamentally for? Use it fundamentally for what you call as what we would call speech offenses or association offenses. People holding posters, people holding placards, people carrying literature with them, literature which is readily and easily available. They're the ones who are being held under this particular law. So the question is fairly widespread. It's across the country, and tomorrow it could be for people who are on the other side. It could be their children who could get picked up under this particular law. If of course people have children and or parents, or how we choose to phrase it, or your friends, who could get picked up under this particular law. So it gives people a sense of fear that you could get picked up under this law. So it's got that potential underlying it, and I think everybody would agree that 10 years is far too long to spend for something you said. I mean, if you've not even done anything, right, how can you hold somebody for 10 years? And you have a right to a fair trial. Here, your right to a fair trial is not being fulfilled because the trial doesn't happen. Because the strategy seems to be, the bail is rolled out, let's hold them for as long as we can. How does it matter? Let them struggle. So that seems to be the mindset of the prosecution in all these matters.
I don't know if everybody will agree to what seems to be a fairly obvious thing. Before we move on to the NIA, I'd like to remind viewers: A, thank you for joining us. B, there is a comments box on the right where you can put questions to our author, Arvind Narrain. The book is India Undeclared Emergency. It's a chapter on what happened in 75-77. Juxtaposes it with what is going on in India today, which is an undeclared emergency. And as a treat, the final chapter gives us tips and wisdom on what it is that can be done to resist this. We go back to the author. Arvind, could you speak about the NIA now, please? Thank you.
Sure. Again, the NIA Act is really passed by the UPA government. There are many dimensions to how the NIA Act dilutes the protections which the accused have under existing criminal law. I'll just speak about one dimension which has been particularly troubling. Again, we can spend an hour talking about the NIA Act, but I'll speak one point on the NIA Act, which is the claim of the Home Minister and the claim in Parliament that the NIA is an extraordinarily successful investigating agency. 90% plus conviction rate. It's trumpeted again and again. They're saying this brilliant new investigation agencies out there on the horizon, and they're doing wonders, which nobody has done till now. Who breaks this up in some fashion is Justice Aftab in a seminar, where he makes the point that when you claim 90%, if you break it up, what does it actually mean? What the sense you get is 90% is always about a year. In that particular year, if there are 80 cases, out of which you get conviction in 60 cases and acquittals in 20, then it's a 90% conviction rate. But as we were discussing, the UAP is not that simple because of the 80 cases in which there's a conviction and acquittal, the 300 cases or 600 cases which are still out there, which are still ongoing. So if you look at it in that context, then the 90% rate will come down to something like 27%.
I'm sorry, you write about something called Katti. Could you just describe to us what that is?
That's the second. I'm coming to that. I'm coming to that point, okay? Because which is the first thing is to say that the way you juggle statistics tells a story. It's not 90% because you look at the cases which are still pending and people are still in jail, and then you're saying 90% conviction rate. What nonsense! I mean, people are still the cases are pending. That's the core story. That's one part of the story. It'll come down to 27%. But 27%, if the NIA gets 27% conviction rate, it's still a very high percentage. Why do I say that? Is because we look at Pota, something like 2% conviction rate, Tada, something like 5% conviction rate, and NIA investigation under the UAPA is 27%. That's still very high. And here's where we come to what criminal law scholar Kunal Ambassador, the point that he makes. He says the strategy used by the NIA is what he calls Katti, which is the idea that you keep a person in jail for 5 years, end of 5 years, you tell that person, say, I'll keep you in jail for another 5 years, you plead guilty. So the person really, what kind of a choice are you giving the person? And what does the lawyer tell his client at that moment in time? Does the lawyer tell the client that, you trust the NIA and plead guilty? Or the lawyer say that, it doesn't matter. You stand for a principle. We will fight this out. You can't give the person a guarantee because the law doesn't allow you any way out of bail anyway. So most lawyers at this moment will throw up their hands and say, you're on your own. You make a call. What call you think is right in these circumstances? Will the NIA stand by the promise? Will they not? We don't know. None of that.
The incentive for the person to plead guilty is to it's just time served already and then you go out.
Exactly. And interestingly enough, actually, if you look at the judgment, one of the Supreme Court judgment in Najib's case, they make this point, right? They say that the NIA has been given enough time, but it's not screened as an endless list of witnesses, right? So that little bit tells you a lot. The NIA is an endless list of witnesses. What does it mean? It's prolonging. That seems to be the strategy. the way I'm reading it. Again, this again needs a lot more work. Again, which tells you where is the work, legal work happening. This is the area which we need to be investigating in greater detail. We need to find out a lot more about how this actual mechanism is working. There needs to be more writing on this in academic journals and in popular journals. We need to be exposing this claims of this 90% in more strong terms, and that work really needs to happen. It's again, since you're a human rights person, you'll understand it's not easy. I'm saying this. Kunal is saying this in his article, but you have to be able to document it using those cases. How do I find out the case in which this particular question of acquittal has happened? This kind of a acquittal has happened, where the entering the plea of guilty has happened. It's not through any large statistics. I have to go to the particular case file, look at the details of that case, and see that particular date on which the person enters the plea guilty. Right? So look at all those cases, follow up on all those cases to find out what are the figures. So this again still at this moment needs further work on. That's where I phrase it. But this will be a hunch.
Could you illustrate for us? And I think the BK16 case does this quite nicely. What the NIA does, both in terms of the state versus union principle in terms of rule of law, and how it is that the union can take over the state, take over a case, and then keep people dissenters locked up.
So thanks, Aakar, for bringing that point out. I got so focused on this one dimension that I didn't mention the other very important dimension, which is equally important.
It's a very rich book, and I think that if you read it, it's not the kind of book that you can flip through in an hour, and that's a good thing. I think that like very many very fine books, this is the kind of text that you will go back to. I certainly have gone back to it more than once, and I think that it's a book that I would highly recommend. It's called India's Undeclared Emergency. It refers to the period between 75 and 77 briefly in the first chapter. Most of the book is about the times that we are living through, and there's a chapter at the end on what it is that can be done. The author is with us. Arvind was speaking about the BK16 case.
Yeah, thanks, Aakar. So the other dimension of the NIA is, which you, as you rightly indicated, that any FIR registered with respect to a scheduled offence, and all UAP offences, sedition offences, are scheduled offence. The knowledge that an FIR has been filed in this particular case has to be transferred to the central government. Central government could then decide that it will investigate that particular scheduled offence. If the central government decides to investigate the scheduled offence, then the state government investigation must then cease, and that's precisely what happened in the BK16. And there's enough analysis which indicates that when the regime changed, when from the BJP to the coalition government in Maharashtra, that's when the shift happened from the investigation by the Pune police to the investigation by the NIA. So it again tells you, and actually you go to the parliamentary debates around this. Our parliamentarians get this point completely clearly. They're very clear. They're saying the big problem with NIA is that federalism. How can the law and order is a state subject? Suddenly you have this investigating agency which overrides the state. Again, look at it. Even the CBI, if it investigate an offence in a particular state, does it get a sanction from the state government? Of course, most states have given a sanction for all cases, etc. But you have the right, you have that power and the right. That power is withdrawn for you as far as the NIA is concerned. Again, thanks to Mr. Chidambaram. He's the one who's responsible for this particular innovation as far as the NIA statute is concerned.
And tell me something, is it egregious what has happened to the BK16? And if so, why is it that it's been so difficult to communicate this through the mainstream media?
Yeah, no, I think that's again a very important question. And in fact, I'll look in some detail as you indicated on the BK16 itself. And what is the threat that the BK16 represents as far as the current government is concerned? What are the values that they stand for, right? And what is the fundamental dimension of the BK16? Why I go in some detail into the BK16? Because I think the 5 forms of activism which are embodied in those who are arrested in the BK16 really embody, in a sense, a larger challenge as far as this regime is concerned. So it's absolutely central to understand the BK16 and the prosecution of the BK16 by this particular government. I just want to point out to the 5 dimensions over here now itself. The first dimension is the prosecution of what you call Dalit activism, There will be our friends from the Kabir Kalaman, Sudhir Davle, as well as uh, Anand Teltumde. And if you look at the writings of Anand Teltumde over the years, all of us who've seen it know that he's a big critic of Hindutva. He doesn't believe it's possible to take forward Dalit politics in a context where Hindutva predominates. He thinks there's a connection between the question of caste and the question of class. There's some larger dimension to the entire question of Hindutva, which will fundamentally destroy Ambedkarite politics. That's the viewpoint you get if you read any of his works. In Gujarat 2002, the strong critic is Anand Teltumde, so you get a sense of where he's coming from on these particular points. Look at Sudhir Davle's work again. He's very clear that the what we need is an Ambedkarite perspective, which looks at caste and class really coming together. And it's not a again. It's a very interesting point where he's very critical of the then of writers of Dalit writers in Maharashtra who participated in the Sammelan organized by the Maharashtra government, which, because his point is this government is fundamentally opposed to the ideals of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, and they should not be appropriated by this particular government. And the Kabir Kala Manch, we know, in terms of if you look at their work, they founded post Gujarat, what happened in Gujarat 2002. And again, they believe in these questions of caste and class really coming together. So the broad point, which all of them communicate, is actually Ambedkar's very important point in the case of Pakistan. The point he makes, he says that Hindu Raj ever comes to this country, it will be the greatest calamity we've ever faced. And so that's the philosophy they communicate. They communicate the philosophy of Rohit Vemula. They communicate the philosophy that this is absolutely integral. The question of Dalit assertion as challenging Hindutva is the central dimension. And that's the dimension which the BJP at all points must suppress. For the BJP, Ambedkar must be appropriated. It's an identity issue. There's no larger dimension. There's nothing, it cannot be critical Hindutva. Again, you go to a range of writings. And again, I refer a little bit to actually a wonderful writer, Banwar Meghwamshi, who writes Why I'm Not a Hindu, I think. Yeah, that's the name of the title. And he says this appropriation of Dalit issues by the BJP. And he refers in particular, he said that, so many violations happen, right? Dalits are not allowed to take part in marriages with horse carriages. They're not allowed to eat at the same table with other Hindus. A range of violations and extreme violations happen. And yet, where is the RSS? Which chicken coop is it hiding in when these violations happen? That's the question he's asking. And that's the question these activists are asking, right? Fundamentally. The second dimension, I think I'll go very quickly through the other four dimensions. We're running out of time. Is the attack on lawyers? That is, be it Sudha Bharadwaj, be it Vernon Gonzalez, be it Arun Ferreira, Sudarshan Dubey. All the lawyers who are representing the clans were picked up under this particular law. And if you look at the recent Mahmood Pacha and the attack on his office and the violation of client confidentiality, you get a sense of the other dimension. The people the state is most concerned about is lawyers. Because of the fact that they are able to push again the normative state, which otherwise becomes very difficult to push.
Sorry, just to clarify, you are referring to the lawyer in Delhi who was representing people in the pogrom of Delhi and had his office raided by the union and by the Delhi police.
Absolutely. Okay. That's the second dimension. Then the third dimension is the Adivasi rights activism. Again, that's Father Stan Swami and Mahesh Raut. And we know this very well. If you look at Father Stan Swami's, what was his fundamental offense as far as the state was concerned? He dared to file a case in the Ranchi High Court on the question of under trials, Adivasi under trials, who have been spending years together in jail. Again, you read Father Stan Swami's work. The point he's making is an entire generation of young people is in jail today. So again, I thought it's a very powerful statement and something which again the state seems to be want to repress and not allow to emerge into any strong fashion. Then the fourth dimension is the activism, which is challenging what you call the secret state or the hidden state or the state within the state. And that's again Gautam Lavalawak and Rona Wilson's work. And there's a few people in this country who have spoken about violations in Chhattisgarh, violations in Kashmir, violations in Northeast. These are not popular issues, and they've dared to take on the state in these questions. And they're the guys who are now in jail. And the last point is, of course, the question of targeting intellectuals. Again, you'd ask the question. I mean, whatever Rao is 80 plus years of age. Why are you imprisoning him? You read his collection of poems. This beautiful introduction by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, in which he says that the the state wants to imprison the imagination, but imagination cannot be imprisoned. And so the imperative of imprisoning someone like Varavara Rao is really imprisoning that in a sense that spirit of resistance, which is so powerful in somebody who's 80 plus years, and you still want to keep him in jail. So I think the BK16 provides a template of what the state's most afraid of, and tells us again, takes us back to the question of resistance. Therefore, what we need to focus on.
Okay, two things briefly before we move to questions. One is you speak of us slouching towards Bethlehem, or in this case, the totalitarian state. What do you mean by that? And what is the totalitarian state, and why should we, in 2022, at the last week of January, be worried about it? What does it look like?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. The totalitarianism I derive from the idea of Linz's framework, distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. The idea of totalitarianism is that the government or the state is not interested in power for its own sake. It is rooted in a certain kind of an ideological framework. One, there's a level of popular support underlying it. The power of the state is buttressed by the power of its tentacles, which spread throughout civil society, and it is not afraid to use the mob as an instrument to achieve its objectives as well. And the point you want to make in all of this is that the totalitarian state is interested in politicizing society, is interested in transforming societal ways of thinking and societal ways of acting, and is interested in that the word totalitarian, it's interested in that form of total power, which is not just power of the state, but power of society as well. That's the dangerous time. Yeah, and you get that point, right? Even when we were talking a little earlier about the love jihad laws. What are the love jihad laws about? Why does the state want to control what you want to eat, who you want to have a relationship with? What is the kind of who can be a citizen in this country? So all of this indicates that totalizing ambition which underlies this regime, which again is the point, which is why we need to take this regime so seriously, is because of its totalitarian ambitions.
Okay, we'll take it seriously. What is it that I can do sitting in my living room listening to an English conversation between two men? And if I feel concerned about this as a citizen or as somebody who lives in India, what is it that I can do?
Sure, the range of things in the final section of the book, I go to that part. But since we're asking particularly of individuals, I'll mention just one point, a couple of points actually. One is the entire question of if we can build a certain sense of an inclusive nationalism, if we can address the issue of inequality in a deeper fashion, if we defend the normative state in the constitutional framework. All of these are tasks which are there.
Can you just speak a little bit about the normative state and the experiences of the person in Israel? I think that might sort of illustrate quite well to people what it is and what it is that can be done. Thanks.
Part of I think the difficult point which we all face is when we're often embedded in our own context and our own position. It's very difficult to think of what might actually work because we're very embedded in where we are. So I did a little bit of looking outside, looking at historical context and looking at contemporary other activist experiences. And Aakar is referring to this beautiful work or very important work by this lawyer called Michael Fard in Israel-Palestine. And the point he makes is that they've had numerous losses, right? They've challenged abductions, they've challenged the entire question of illegal settlements, they challenged the building of the wall, they've challenged the entire question of assassinations, they've challenged torture. In almost all cases, they come up with a defeat. So the question people have is what keeps you going? How do you keep going in a question where everything you do, you get literally a defeat? And Michael Fard's answer to that is he says that, each time you go to court and you make an argument, you're producing an indictment of the of the totalitarian state or the regime, as it were. And producing that kind of an indictment is actually a way of asserting the importance of the normative state or the importance of the rule of law. And his point is you keep doing this, you keep pushing till at some point the state that gives way. And the argument, of course, comes in terms of like at some point, his argument is at some point apartheid South Africa collapsed. At some point, the Soviet Union collapsed. At some point, the Burma regime at that moment in time collapsed. So you have to keep at that work. You might not see it in the immediate sense, but that work will have benefit or will bear fruit. And you have to think in this point. You don't think of the work that you do merely in terms of success and defeat. Think in a slightly more longer term perspective of how does your work
just showing up to quote and just making sure that you push for the right side. Okay, sorry for viewers. The book is called The Wall and the Gate. The author is Michael Sfard, S-F-A-R-D. It's there on Libgen, which I downloaded after reading Arvind's book. I would recommend that book very highly. It's extremely anecdotal and extremely readable as well. Sorry, Arvind. Did you want to complete this point?
No, just the point that between the victory and defeat, the other point would be that through your work, how do you build a community of resistance? I think that's the point we're getting to actually. How do you build that sense of a community, which says that we are going to resist this, right? And just if you speak to any of our very inspirational lawyers in the Indian context, be it Rebecca John or others doing this really incredible work, And you can see a lot of younger people very moved and saying that, we want to be a part of this resistance as well. Regardless of the victory or defeat, we want to be part of this movement to oppose this kind of a regime.
My last question on this, and you can expand on the other things that you have spoken and written about in this chapter, is on the revival of forms of dissent rooted in culture and faith. Could you just describe to us what you mean by that and how it will help us in the times that we live in?
Yeah, see, one of the critiques which we often face as Aakar indicated, as human rights activists, is that, what you're saying doesn't have a great appeal. People really don't understand this. What are you speaking about? One point, of course, is that the Constitution and the preamble have a broader appeal beyond us, because we go to the Dalit movement, go to a range of movements, go to the CAA. They made the preamble a popular artifact, as it were. It became a part of people's consciousness. So that's one part of it. But even beyond that, even outside that, there are also traditions and within culture itself. I'll just give one example from Karnataka, the state I'm most familiar with, having lived here, is look at Basawa's opposition to the status quo in the 12th century. If people haven't read it, read the Girish Karna's play Taledanda, about which is a very beautiful extract in Sunil Kilnani's book called Incarnations, right? And what he says, what Karnad says about Basawa, is Basawa presides over the marriage of between cutting across lines of caste. And the way he describes it is this is not a marriage, it is a revolution. In 12th century, in Karnataka, where Basavana is saying this, and in 2020, 2022, the Karnataka government dares enact a law which destroys everything that this philosophy stands for. So we need to re-invoke the cultural memory of Basava and say, hey, this is not the way. That's one argument. Shall I make one more point, or we have time, or we'll stop with this one?
We do. Very briefly, thanks.
Okay, no, we'll carry on.
Okay, so we'll start with the questions. The first one is a rapid fire round. Indira or Modi, whose contribution is more dangerous for India's democracy? By Joydev Ghaur. You can only give one name. You can't give a sort of on the one hand and on the Modi. Okay, excellent. We have a slightly technical question from Mihir Mahajan. I'll try and find it. He said that the amendment that was made recently in UAPA said that individuals could now be designated terrorists in addition to those not listed on the 35 or so organizations. His question is, have any individuals been arrested under UAPA without being associated under that change in law?
No, as far as I know, no.
No, so the law has been put in place, but so far as we know, nobody has been picked up under that law. Just for viewers' sakes, this is an amendment, one of many that the BJP has made, which lets the state arrest those people who are not on the list of who are not members of the list of designated terrorist organizations. The state has the power to designate individuals as being terrorists and pick them up. There is a question which asks a wonderful question: will the Modi government survive in the long term? Political question, but I think you should take it.
I think not, because the range of forces which are emerging in opposition to it are really across the spectrum. If you read the recent entire question of the anti-farm laws, the anti-CAA protests, gives you a sense that it's not a coalition which is founded on that kind of a strength. The longer you push this the one-trick pony, the Hindutva agenda, the more people say that there's nothing here. There's absolutely nothing. That's Aakar's big point in his book.
There is a question, I think, which is aimed at me. It's a one-word question which says pseudo, and I think the answer to that would be yes. There is a comment from Sudarshan Dubey saying Hindu Zindabad. I agree with that. A question saying, why is there no Indian jurisprudence? I think that's a good question. I don't know whether what is meant is an Indianization of common law. Or what are your thoughts on the judiciary, generally speaking, and its performance?
The Indian jurisprudence question, again, is my reading is, I would say that the Indian constitutional product of the Indian independence struggle is a product of the struggle against caste domination, and that is an Indian jurisprudence. So, I mean, you need to go to the jurisprudence that we have and say that it is our contribution. Our contribution is not just what is there in the Shastras and the Puranas, but also what we learned and achieved through the independence struggle. And if the Constitution is a product of the struggle, that's an Indian jurisprudence.
Tell me something. There's a question which I can't find now on Pegasus. What are your thoughts on what is going on right now, both in terms of the intrusion into civil liberties and the role of the Supreme Court?
On the role of the Supreme Court in particular, right? If you look at the previous judgment on the ban on internet communication in Kashmir, the current Chief Justice was a judge in that particular decision, and he's the one who constituted a committee. Let the committee decide. That was the line which was taken there, and this seems to have followed through on the same kind of line. You constitute a committee, let the committee decide. And the strong feeling is, I mean, the facts are there. The court should come to a finding and a conclusion. Why are they subdelegating what is their power to a committee? That question is again that I think top of everybody's minds. And is this a strategy by which you keep everybody happy? That's the question.
So what you're saying is that the court has done what the state would have liked it to have done.
No, I think it's in between. I think I don't think the state's fully happy. We're not fully happy either because we feel this should go much further. So I think the space for struggle is still open. We need to engage with the committee and push the committee as far as we can.
Okay, one last question. Do you agree that there is an emergency-like situation also in states like Maharashtra and Bengal, which have had reports, several of them, of human rights violations by the state and by parties not necessarily associated with the BJP?
See, if you look at the Indian state as we're talking about balance between prerogative state and the normative state, I think the current regime moves far ahead of every other regime. The fact that the UAPA existed, the fact that the Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act, the fact that Bengal has a range of the legislations as well. To argue that these states are wonderful to live in and the human rights violation would be complete travesty. As human rights activists, our job is to critique who the state might be. We're not discriminative. We don't say that we will support state A or state B. Our only point in this case is this state has an added dimension of totalitarian ambition, which makes it far more difficult than the regime you're referring to.
We haven't spoken much about minorities and what it is that happens and has been happening. Do you have any comments on what has been happening under by way of law or by way of majoritarianism on this?
Yeah, no, I look a little bit in detail into this. In fact, I look at the question of how has majoritarianism been entrenched in terms of the legal framework. And a couple of points are there. One is, of course, the CAA. You all know the CAA story, and the fact that you're entrenching a certain kind of majoritarian idea in the law. Right? CAA linked to NPR to NRC, and Aakar's book is a great illustration of this. You get a sense of how dangerous that entire phenomenon is. Right? The second, of course, is the entire question of the beef laws. Again, you look at that. These have an old history. links back to the directive principles of state policy. But there's a tightening over a period of time. And today, the laws are far more dangerous than they were even in that period of time. And thirdly, is of course the anti-conversion laws. Right? Anti-conversion laws again have an older history. But look at the latest version in the Karnataka context. I mean, I just want to make and maybe end on that one point, which I think is important for people to acknowledge. Is previously the question as far as conversion was concerned was we were thinking in terms of some form of notice which had to be given. That was the extent to which it went.
So basically, if you wanted to convert, you filled out a form and sent it to the government for it to approve.
This was a bill which was mooted by Nehru, which is not. I mean, you don't have to do it, which was not accepted, which didn't go any further because Nehru struck it down at the moment of that. But after that, the laws which are upheld by the Supreme Court are laws where conversion by inducement was linked to fraud and misrepresentation. What is inducement? Aakar, why didn't you join Christianity? I mean, maybe you'll get a place in heaven. Is that inducement? There's very many complicated questions on inducement. And do you infantilize? Do I infantilize Aakar by telling him this? I mean, Aakar can make up his mind and say, hey, I'm not joining your faith. Go to hell. And he can very well say that. But instead, inducement is made a criminal offense. That's one part of the story. But the current law, the Karnataka law, I just want to bring this to everybody's attention, defines what is called allurement. Allurement could be offer of any kind of educational facility or of any kind of a philanthropic facility to a person for the purpose of conversion. And then they've also reversed what you call the burden of proof. This again was not there in any previous law. So today what happens, right? I don't get a seat in St. Joseph's College of Commerce, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and speak to the father principals and say that, I'm filing a case of conversion by allurement against you. And then let the father principal or whoever it is resolve the matter in court over a couple of years because the burden of proof is reversed. I make an allegation. That's all I need to do. So today, they've gone on to criminalize basically what I call faith, love, and charity. All the Christian principles are criminalized as far as this Karnataka bill is concerned. And I think same thing will apply to the UP law as well. So.
Okay, last question. Who's going to win UP?
No, I'm not a psophologist. That I will not be. It's outside my realm of competence.
Arvind Narrain, the book is called India's Undeclared Emergency. It's wonderful. It's a book that you can go back to often, written very lucidly. Thank you very much, Arvind Narrain, for joining us. Thank you very much to Scroll for having this event. Thank you, most of all, to all of you for having given us the time. Arvind, would you like to say goodbye to your fans?
Yeah, thanks Aakar for really this fantastic conversation, and thanks to Scroll for hosting this. Thanks everybody for watching as well.
There were many other questions that